A woman walking alone in the Oregon woods discovers a hidden house without doors, a silent, sealed concrete structure buried beneath years of dirt and vines. But when she hears a faint voice from inside, she calls the police, and what they uncover will leave you speechless. But before we dive in, tell us, where are you watching from? We love seeing our global family in the comments. Let's get started. They say the quietest people often stumble upon the loudest secrets. And maybe that's true. Madeline was just 39, still young in many ways, but her eyes carried the kind of stillness that only comes from walking through fire and somehow surviving. After a painful divorce and years of feeling like a ghost in her own life, she'd packed up everything and moved to a quiet cedar cabin tucked deep in the Oregon woods. No phone service, no city lights, just trees, wind, and space to breathe again. Her days were simple. Morning coffee wrapped in a blanket, pages of her old journal filling slowly, and long walks down forgotten forest trails. She wasn't running from the world anymore. She was just trying to remember who she used to be. That day was like any other until it wasn't. The leaves crunched softly beneath her boots as she wandered a trail she'd never noticed before. Something caught her eye, buried under vines, and dirt was a slab of concrete, worn and strange. She knelt down, brushed it off, and frowned. No door, no windows, just a structure sunken deep into the earth, like it was never meant to be found. And somehow, she just knew this wasn't going to be another quiet walk. Madeline crouched beside the concrete structure, heart thudding with a rhythm she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not yet, but something deeper. Instinct. Like the forest itself had exhaled and whispered, "Look closer." She ran her fingers along the cold, rough surface. It wasn't just a random chunk of concrete. There were lines, edges, corners that didn't belong in the natural flow of the woods. Something built with purpose, hidden with intent. Most people would have walked away, left it there, buried beneath time and nature. But Madeline wasn't most people. She circled the slab, brushing away dead leaves and pulling at thick vines. That's when she found it barely visible, a thin fracture in the wall, just wide enough to suggest a gap, a passage, maybe. And when she pressed her ear against it, she swore she heard something faint, rhythmic, like humming or breathing. She stumbled back. Her breath caught. "Don't be ridiculous," she muttered. "It's probably air pressure. An animal." But even as she said it, her gut told her otherwise. Madeline backed away, pulled out her phone. No service, not even a flicker of a bar. Her cabin was a good 20-minute walk back through the trees, but adrenaline sharpened her steps. She nearly jogged the entire way, boots slipping on mossy roots, hands shaking as she reached the front porch. She didn't even take off her coat. The police dispatcher didn't know what to make of her story. "No door. No windows, ma'am. Are you sure it wasn't a well or a storm shelter?" "I'm not sure of anything," Madeline said. "That's why I need someone to come out here." To their credit, they did. 2 officers arrived about 45 minutes later. Officer Keene, grizzled and skeptical, and Officer Ramos, younger, more curious. Madeline led them back down the trail, trying to keep her nerves in check. The forest, which had once felt comforting, now seemed to hold its breath. They reached the structure. The officers exchanged a glance. "This is weird," Ramos murmured, crouching to examine the crack. "You weren't kidding." Keene tapped on the concrete with his knuckles, hollow. What Madeline's voice quivered. "There's something inside." Ramos pulled a small flashlight from his belt and shined it through the narrow crack. I can't see much. Wait, hold on. He angled it differently, his brow furrowed. What do you see? Madeline asked, stepping closer. He didn't answer at first, then quietly, there's light. Inside. Keene straightened up, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. Stay back, he told Madeline. I told you, she whispered. I heard something. They radioed it in, and within the hour, a full team was on site, local search and rescue, a structural engineer, even someone from the sheriff's department. The forest, once silent and forgotten, now buzzed with voices, equipment, urgency. The crew widened the crack carefully. Dust exploded outward as a panel shifted open with a loud groan, revealing a staircase that descended into blackness. It was a bunker. Not a fallout shelter or storm hideout, this was something else. The air that poured out was stale but breathable. A long, concrete corridor stretched ahead, lit by flickering overhead bulbs powered by a generator somewhere deep inside. And then came the sound. A faint voice. A person. Help! Madeline's knees buckled slightly. Officer Ramos caught her arm. The rescue team moved fast. Flashlights swept the space. Radios crackled with code and instructions. Within minutes, they found her. A girl, barely in her 20s. Thin, pale, alive. She was curled on a small cot in a room with no windows. No warmth. Her eyes blinked against the light. Her lips trembled. She didn't even ask who they were, only whispered. Is it over? Madeline couldn't look away. She didn't know who this girl was, how long she'd been there, or who had put her in that place. But she knew what it felt like to be trapped. Not physically, but emotionally. Spiritually. To feel like no one even knew where you were. The girl's name was Lacy. She had been missing for nearly 7 years. Her face had once been on the local news, then slowly faded from memory, just another tragedy that people eventually stopped mentioning. Until now. Her abductor, still unknown. The bunker, not listed in any official blueprints, not owned by any registered name or business. A ghost structure completely off the grid. The investigation would go on for months. Interviews, DNA, psych evaluations. But for now, Lacy was safe, alive, breathing air she hadn't tasted in nearly a decade. And Madeline became a local legend. She didn't want recognition. She didn't speak to the press. When they asked why she went back, what pushed her to investigate something so strange, she simply said, I think I was meant to find her. But deep down, she knew it was something else. That empty part of her, that hollow space left by grief and betrayal, it had drawn her to something buried, something forgotten. And in saving someone else, she had started to save herself. For days after the discovery, Madeline couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Lacy's face, those hollow cheeks, those eyes that had forgotten how to hope. And every time she opened them, she wondered if she had truly walked away from that place, or if a part of her was still down there. The authorities did their best to shield the public from the details, but the town buzzed with questions. People came out of the woodwork with theories, memories, whispers of old rumors. Some claimed to have heard strange sounds in those woods for years. Others swore they'd seen shadows moving between the trees at night. Madeline stayed quiet, but something was bothering her. Something she hadn't told the police, not because she wanted to keep secrets, but because it felt personal. Sacred, even. The day they opened the bunker, just before the officers arrived. She had spotted something odd just to the right of the slab. A second slab, smaller, mostly buried. She hadn't mentioned it, thinking it was just debris. But now, it gnawed at her. Why was it there? Why had she felt drawn to it? One early morning, with dew still clinging to the blades of grass, Madeline returned alone. The forest greeted her in hushed tones, as if it, too, remembered. She reached the original site, now surrounded by yellow tape and signs warning active investigation area, do not enter. But a few yards away, covered again by soil and moss, was the second slab. Her heart thumped. She knelt, brushed away layers of damp earth, and felt it again, that same artificial smoothness, the same cold that didn't belong. This wasn't a bunker. It was a hatch. Rusty bolts lined the edges, no visible lock, no hinges. But something was under there, and just like the first time, something in her gut said, "Don't ignore this." Madeline stood, debating whether to go straight to the authorities. But just then a sound, a faint, metallic click, like a latch sliding into place or coming undone. She froze. "Was someone down there?" Slowly. She stepped back. Her instincts screamed for her to run, but something stronger rooted her in place. And then movement. From behind her, a branch snapped. She turned sharply. No one. Another snap, closer this time. Madeline's breath quickened. She wasn't alone. "Hello," she called out, voice trembling. No answer. She started backing away towards the trail, never turning her back completely. Then, something caught her eye. A camera? Tiny. Old. Hidden in the bark of a nearby tree. Wired. She stared at it in disbelief. It wasn't active, not blinking, but it had once been used. Watching. Recording. That meant whoever built that bunker had been watching the forest, possibly watching her. And if there were more cameras, then maybe they saw Lacy. Maybe they knew someone would eventually come looking. Maybe it had all been part of the plan. By the time she reached her cabin, her legs were shaking. She called Officer Ramos directly. "I found something," she whispered. "And I think someone was watching me." They came faster this time. A forensic team combed the area. They found 3 hidden cameras. One aimed at the trail, one at the bunker, one directly facing Madeline's usual walking path. Wired together. Battery-powered. Old tech, but sophisticated enough to last undetected for years. And under the second slab, another chamber. Not for people, for equipment. It was a control room. Old monitors, hard drives, blueprints. Madeline stood behind the officers as they explored, watching their faces shift from curiosity to disbelief. This wasn't just a place to hide someone, Ramos muttered. It was built to monitor them. Worse, some of the recovered footage showed not just the forest, but inside the bunker. The girl had been watched. Every moment. But the true shock came when they opened one of the metal drawers. Inside, dozens of IDs, old, faded, from women. Different names, different faces. Not all matched missing persons reports. Some didn't match anything at all. Madeline stepped back. Dizzy. "You think there were more?" Officer Keene didn't answer. He didn't have to. The air hung heavy with implication. Whoever did this had done it more than once. And if not for Madeline, Lacy might have just been another forgotten name in a drawer. That night, Madeline sat by her fireplace, wrapped in the same blanket she always wore during storms. But this time, the storm wasn't outside. It was in her. She wasn't sure what haunted her more, the evil that had lingered so close to her home for so long, or the fact that no one had known, that people could disappear, suffer, and the world simply moved on. She looked at the woods through her window. They didn't feel the same anymore. They weren't peaceful now. They were hiding too much. But in the middle of all that darkness was a light. Lacy was safe. She was speaking again, eating, smiling, slowly, and Madeline had found something more than a girl in need. She had found purpose. She had walked into the woods to escape her life. And somehow, she had walked out with someone else's. The days that followed were unlike anything Madeline had ever known. Reporters showed up at her cabin, cameras rolling, voices polished and eager for headlines. The town, once a sleepy corner of Oregon barely marked on most maps, had become a storm of questions, theories, and fear. She didn't answer any of them. Not because she didn't have words. Madeline had always been thoughtful, articulate, but because something inside her had shifted. Deeply, irreversibly. What she had seen inside that bunker, what they had found beneath the forest floor, it changed the way she saw the world. But more than that, it changed the way she saw herself. She had spent most of her adult life fading into the background. Her marriage had been quiet on the surface, but hollow behind closed doors. Years of small silences, sacrifices, apologies that only she seemed to give. When it ended, no one was surprised, not even her. She moved to the woods not out of bravery, but out of exhaustion, like someone trying to outrun a life they barely remembered choosing. At first, solitude had felt like peace, but now she understood it had really been numbness. She had walked the forest trails each day thinking she was healing, but healing doesn't always look like silence. Sometimes, it looks like choosing to care again, even when it hurts. That shift happened the moment she heard the voice in the bunker. It hadn't just been a cry for help. It had been a call back to life. One evening, after the investigators had cleared out for the day, Madeline returned to the site not out of obligation, but because her heart pulled her there. The forest was quiet again. The police tape fluttered gently in the wind. Most people avoided the area now, calling it cursed, haunted even. But Madeline didn't feel fear anymore. She felt responsibility. She sat down on a rock, gazing at the space where the hatch had been. There was nothing left to find, not physically. But her mind kept replaying a moment over and over again. Lacy's eyes when they first met. They hadn't just held pain, they held recognition. Not as in, do I know you, but something deeper. Like you know what it's like, too. Don't you? Madeline hadn't been locked in a bunker, but she had been trapped. Trapped in a life that told her to shrink herself. Trapped in guilt she didn't earn. Trapped in the lie that her story no longer mattered. Until now. A week later, Lacy asked to see her. Madeline didn't expect it. She thought the girl would have forgotten her, or wanted space. But when she arrived at the recovery center, Lacy smiled. A real smile. Tired. Yes, but not empty. I remember your voice. She said, when you called for help, it sounded like someone who really meant it. Madeline sat beside her, unsure of what to say. I didn't think anyone would ever find me. Lacy continued. I prayed for someone. Anyone. But I never thought it'd be someone like you. Someone like me, Madeline asked gently. Lacy nodded. You didn't look like a hero. You looked sad. Like me. Like you'd been forgotten too. Madeline blinked, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. She had spent so much time hiding from the world, convinced that what was broken inside her made her weak. But maybe it had made her the exact person Lacy needed. Maybe broken hearts could recognize each other in a way whole ones never could. From that day on, Madeline stopped walking away from things. She began walking toward them. She met with the families of other women whose IDs were found in the hidden chamber. She attended community meetings, helped organize vigils, even began working with a local non-profit that supported survivors of abduction and abuse. For the first time in her life, her voice carried weight, and she wasn't afraid to use it. Some people called her a hero. She always shook her head. No, I was just walking through the woods, and I finally looked up. One rainy afternoon, months later, Madeline found herself standing at the edge of the same trail where it all began. The trees stood tall as ever, their leaves heavy with mist. The path ahead was muddy, winding, mysterious. She closed her eyes and listened, not for breathing, or humming, or danger, but for truth. The kind that comes when you finally let go of who you were and begin becoming who you were always meant to be. And there, in the quiet, Madeline whispered something to the wind. Thank you for letting me find her. Thank you for letting her find me. It started with a letter. Handwritten. No return address. Just a simple cream-colored envelope left on Madeline's porch one morning in early spring, tucked beneath a small bouquet of wildflowers. She opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. Inside, the handwriting was neat but uncertain, as if the writer had hesitated over every word. You don't know me, but I know about you. My sister was one of the names found in that drawer. We thought she just ran away. We gave up. But you didn't. Thank you for looking when no one else did. Thank you for proving she mattered. Madeline read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling slightly. It wasn't long or poetic, but it carried the weight of generations of silence finally breaking. She placed the letter on the mantel, right above the fireplace, and sat in her chair, staring into the quiet crackle of the flames. She had no idea how many lives that bunker had touched. No idea how many stories had been buried beneath the trees. But now, those voices were finding their way back to the surface, and something inside her whispered, "This is just the beginning." The non-profit center that had helped Lacy offered Madeline a role not as a counselor or administrator, but as something far more personal, a mentor. At first, she hesitated. Who was she to guide anyone she wasn't trained? She didn't have credentials. All she had was a cabin in the woods, a past full of shadows, and a few moments of courage that came from desperation. But Lacy, now living in a safe apartment nearby, encouraged her. You don't need to have answers, she told her. You just need to show up. So she did. Once a week, Madeline drove into town and sat in a circle with women of all ages. Some had escaped abuse, others were still fighting through trauma. Some had only recently found their way out of dark places they never thought they'd survive. Madeline didn't say much at first, but when she did speak, the room always grew still. Because she didn't talk like someone who taught healing, she talked like someone who had lived it. One day, a girl named Josie, just 17, asked her, "Do you think people like us can ever feel normal again?" Madeline thought for a moment. Then she smiled softly and said, "I think we get to create a new version of normal, one that's built on truth, not silence, not shame." Josie nodded slowly, her eyes welling with tears. And in that moment, Madeline realized something profound. Her pain had become someone else's map. The media attention eventually faded, as it always does. The cameras left. The headlines shifted to something newer, flashier. But Madeline's work continued quietly, steadily. She helped organize a memorial near the site of the hidden chambers, carved from the very stone that once sealed them shut. It wasn't grand, just a bench, a plaque, and a path lined with wildflowers. The inscription read, "For those who were lost, and for those who were found, for the ones who screamed in silence, and the ones who finally heard them, you are not forgotten." People came, not in droves, but enough. Some left flowers, some left letters. Some just sat and cried. And through it all, Madeline stood nearby, not as a hero, but as a witness, someone who knew how important it was to be seen. In the months that followed, Madeline began writing again. Not in her old journals with torn pages and broken thoughts, but in a small notebook with a leather cover Lacy had given her. "This is for your real story," she'd said. And so she wrote. She wrote about the forest, about the silence that taught her how to listen, about grief, and how it doesn't disappear, it just changes shape, about the strange kind of love that grows from shared survival. She never intended to publish it, but one of the volunteers at the center, a former editor, read a few pages and gently asked, "Would you let others read this?" Madeline didn't answer right away. But that night, by the fireplace, she thought about all the women sitting in circles, about the girl who left the letter, about Lacy. And she realized her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every person who had ever been silenced, buried, or told they were too broken to matter. By the time autumn came again, Madeline had a routine one that no longer felt like escape, but like service. She walked the woods not to run from her past, but to remember the moment her life had changed. She lit a candle every evening for the names they had found, and the ones they hadn't. She continued mentoring, listening, writing. And one morning, she received another letter. This one was from a mother who had watched the news, read Madeline's story, and found the courage to report her missing daughter, something she had been too afraid to do for years. They found the girl, alive. Not in a bunker, but in a dangerous situation that could have ended very differently, if not for Madeline's story. The mother ended the letter with words that stayed with Madeline forever. "You didn't just find one girl. You gave the rest of us permission to hope." The first snowfall came early that year. Madeline stood at the edge of the memorial path, snowflakes melting on her coat, watching as the world around her fell into a hush only winter could bring. She clutched a folded piece of paper in her gloved hand, one she hadn't dared open until now. It was from Lacy. They hadn't spoken in over a month. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because healing sometimes required distance. And Madeline, more than anyone, understood that people needed space to breathe, to fall apart, and to find their own way back again. But this letter, it wasn't just a thank you note. It was a goodbye. "Dear Madeline, I don't think I'd be alive if you hadn't walked that trail. But more than saving me, you believed me. You didn't ask if I was sure or if I was exaggerating. You just listened. I'm moving to Colorado with my aunt. It's time. But before I go, I want you to know something. I used to think the worst thing in life was being trapped. But it's not. The worst thing is thinking you don't matter enough for anyone to come looking." Madeline's tears blurred the words, but she kept reading. "You came looking. And because of that, I'll never forget who I am again." She folded the letter slowly, pressing it against her heart. The woods had once swallowed her sorrow. Now they held her purpose. Later that night, she returned home and lit the fire. The cabin glowed with the warmth of quiet memory. But there was a knock at the door, soft, hesitant. She opened it to find Josie, the 17-year-old girl from the recovery circle, standing in the snow, coat too thin, eyes too red. Madeline didn't ask questions. She just opened the door wider and pulled her inside. They sat by the fire for hours. Josie spoke in fragments about a foster home she'd run from, a man who said he loved her but only broke her down, about nights spent sleeping in cars and libraries. And then she said something that broke Madeline completely. "I wanted to go back, to the man who hurt me, because at least I knew he'd notice if I was gone." Madeline didn't say anything right away. Her throat closed tight. But she reached out, gently took Josie's hand, and said, "You are not invisible anymore." The words hung in the air like a promise. Josie stayed the night, and then the week. Eventually, with help from the nonprofit and legal support, Madeline became her temporary guardian. It wasn't planned. It wasn't easy. But it felt right. There were moments Madeline doubted herself. Nights Josie screamed from nightmares. Mornings she refused to speak at all. But through every storm, Madeline stayed. Because she remembered what it was like to wake up and wonder if anyone cared whether you did or not. And slowly, Josie changed. She began leaving drawings around the cabin, sketches of trees, wolves, stars. She helped Madeline plant bulbs for spring. She started reading books out loud, sitting by the fire in the same chair Lacy once had. And one evening, as the sky turned pink through the frosted windows, Josie whispered something that made Madeline's heart ache in the most beautiful way. "I don't want to disappear anymore." Madeline realized then, growth doesn't come in one grand moment. It comes in whispers, in quiet choices, in saying yes when you're terrified, and staying even when you feel like running. She had spent so many years believing her life was too small to mean anything. But now, her small life was saving others. One day, the nonprofit asked Madeline if she'd speak at a survivors conference in Portland. She almost said no. But Josie looked at her and said, "I'll sit in the front row. I want to see you be brave." So she went. She stood behind a podium in a room filled with strangers, some with scars on their skin, others with scars hidden in places no one could see. She held a copy of Lacy's letter, Josie's first sketch, and a small stone she'd taken from the trail the day she found the hatch. And she said, "I am not a rescuer. I am not a hero. I am a woman who spent most of her life believing she had no voice, until a stranger cried out, and I realized I could answer." The room was silent. Then, one by one, people stood, applauding, crying, not because her story was extraordinary, but because it was real. That night, Madeline returned home to find Josie asleep in her chair, a book in her lap, the fire gently glowing. She sat beside her, pulled a blanket over both of them, and let the quiet settle in. She had not asked for this life, but it had become the most sacred gift she'd ever been given. It had been a year, 12 full months since Madeline first stepped off that quiet trail and uncovered a world that had been buried not only beneath the forest but within herself. The seasons had turned gently spring thawed into summer, then softened into fall, and now winter had returned once more. But everything felt different now. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of names remembered, lives reclaimed, wounds healing. On the morning of the anniversary, Madeline rose before dawn. The sky was still ink blue when she slipped on her boots, pulled on her wool coat, and quietly stepped outside. Careful not to wake Josie, who now called the cabin home with a casualness that made Madeline smile every time she heard the words, "I'm home." She carried nothing but a single candle in a glass jar and a folded note in her coat pocket. The forest welcomed her like an old friend. The path to the memorial was dusted with frost, and the trees whispered softly in the wind. Her steps were slow, deliberate, as if each one was in sync with the beating of something older, something deeper than memory. When she reached the bench, the one carved from the same stone that once hid so much pain, she sat down and lit the candle. A warm flicker against the cold. Then, slowly, she unfolded the note and read aloud. For every voice that was silenced, for every soul who thought they were forgotten, for every step taken in fear that still led to freedom, this is for you. Her voice trembled slightly, not from sadness, but from gratitude. She sat in silence for a while after that, remembering, not just Lacy's voice calling out from beneath the earth, not just the hidden cameras or the girl who showed up at her door in the middle of a snowstorm, but the moment she stopped running from her own life. That had been the real rescue. Because you don't have to be buried to feel trapped. You don't have to be behind walls to feel forgotten. And you don't have to be bleeding to need saving. Sometimes, all it takes is for someone to say, "I see you. You still matter." And that's what she had become. Not a savior, a witness, a light bearer, a keeper of stories. That evening, Josie surprised her with a small gathering at the cabin, just a few people from the support group, the nonprofit, and some neighbors who had come to know Madeline's story. There was a quiet pot of stew warming on the stove, mismatched mugs of cider, and soft music playing from a tiny old radio that Josie had fixed herself. Laughter filled the corners of the cabin. Soft, honest, earned. And Madeline, watching it all from the edge of the room, felt something rise in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that comes from hiding, or silence, or solitude, but the kind that comes when you know you've done what you were meant to do, that you showed up, that you stayed, that you listened when it mattered most. Later that night, Josie handed her a gift wrapped in brown paper and tied with a simple string. Madeline opened it carefully. Inside was a book. Her book. The pages of her journal, now typed and bound her story, Lacy's and even Josie's, woven together like the threads of something ancient and unbreakable. On the title page, Josie had written, "This isn't just your story anymore, it's ours, and someone out there needs to read it, just like we needed to live it." Madeline couldn't speak. She simply held the book to her chest as tears ran quietly down her cheeks. Weeks later, the book would reach a woman across the country who hadn't spoken to her daughter in years and inspire her to reconnect. It would be passed around in therapy circles, in shelters, in prisons. It would be highlighted, dog-eared, scribbled on, and in every hand it touched, a little piece of Madeline's fire would flicker to life. She would never become famous. She didn't want to, but her story would matter. And that was everything. In the final pages of the book, Madeline had written something that still echoed in the minds of all who read it. If you ever find yourself walking a trail you don't remember choosing, if you stumble upon something buried inside the woods or inside yourself, don't run, look closer. The things we bury don't disappear. They wait for light, and maybe, just maybe, you were born to bring it. Anyone can bring light into the darkness if they're willing to stop, look closer, and care enough not to walk away. As the wind whispered through the pines above the old forest trail, Madeline closed the final page of her journal, not with a period, but with a beginning. She wasn't writing her own healing anymore. She was writing a guide for others still trying to find their way out. This story didn't belong to just her now. It belonged to every girl who had been told to stay quiet, every boy who thought no one would come for him, every survivor still carrying the weight of silence, and every soul who ever asked, "Do I matter?" The woman who once walked the woods to forget had become the one who would never let someone be forgotten again. Because for Madeline and for those she touched, hope wasn't found at the end of the path. It was found when she chose to walk it, even alone. The end. Up next, 2 more stories that will move your heart. Click to keep walking with us, and don't forget to subscribe if you believe that no voice deserves to be left unheard.